My name is Detective James Holloway. I'm 46 years old and I've been a cop for over 2 decades. But right now I'm not on duty. I'm supposed to be on forced leave because my department thinks I've been too obsessed with a case they told me to drop. But I can't let it go. Not when 3 groups of tourists have disappeared from the same remote camping area in Monument Valley over the past decade, and no one has any answers. So here I am, driving my old GMC motorhome RV through the red sands of the Utah-Arizona border. To anyone watching, I look like just another guy on vacation, but inside my RV is a different story. The walls are covered with maps, photos, and notes about the disappearances. It's my mobile investigation unit, and I'm determined to figure out what's going on before someone else vanishes. When I first arrived at Monument Valley, I met Maria Tsosi. She's a Navajo park ranger who knows these lands better than anyone. She wasn't thrilled about helping me, especially since I'm not here officially, but after some convincing, she agreed to guide me through the restricted areas of the park. Maria is sharp and no nonsense, and she made it clear that she doesn't believe in my theories about something strange happening here. People get lost, she said flatly. It's a dangerous place if you don't know what you're doing. Then there's Lucas Powell. He's 17 years old, and the only survivor of one of the disappearances 3 years ago. I brought him along because, well, honestly, I don't know why he survived when everyone else didn't. Lucas doesn't talk much about what happened back then, but he agreed to come with me after I promised to help him figure out what really happened to his friends. On my second night here, after setting up camp near one of the disappearance sites, I was staring at my caseboard inside the RV. Patterns were starting to emerge, locations where people vanished, dates that lined up too perfectly to be random, but nothing concrete yet. Maria stood outside by the fire, keeping her distance from me and my crazy theories, while Lucas sat quietly nearby, sketching something in his notebook. I thought this was going to be another long night of staring at clues that didn't add up. But that was before things started getting strange. That second night, something happened that I can't explain. I was sitting inside the RV going over my notes when I heard it. At first, it sounded like a normal echo, a faint repeat of my own voice as I muttered to myself. But then I realized something was off. The echo wasn't just repeating what I said. It was ahead of me, like it was answering me before I even spoke. I froze listening. "Hello?" I called out just to test it. "Hello," came the reply. Only it came before I'd finished saying the word. I stepped outside to see if Maria or Lucas had heard it too. Maria was leaning against a rock, staring at the horizon where the sun was setting. The sky was painted in deep reds and oranges, but something about the shadows on the canyon walls caught my attention. They didn't look right. The shapes were jagged and stretched in ways that didn't match the rocks casting them. "Do you see that?" I asked Maria, pointing at the shadows. She nodded slowly, her face serious. "Yeah, but that doesn't make sense." She glanced at me, her usual skepticism replaced by something else, something closer to unease. Meanwhile, Lucas was sitting by the fire, clutching his notebook tightly. He looked pale and shaken. "What's wrong?" I asked him. He didn't answer at first. Then he held up his notebook and showed me what he'd been drawing. It was a symbol, an odd, swirling shape that I didn't recognize. "I keep seeing this in my dreams," he said quietly. "Every night since they disappeared." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and told him to get some rest. But as the night went on, things only got stranger. Around midnight, Maria and I decided to take a walk around the campsite to look for anything unusual. That's when we found it. A pile of belongings half buried in the sand, backpacks, water bottles, even a pair of hiking boots. They were arranged in a strange pattern, almost like a ritual or offering of some kind. Maria crouched down to examine them. "These don't belong here," she said firmly. "This area's been closed off for years." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Do you think these belong to?" She didn't answer, but her silence said enough. When we got back to the RV, Lucas was tossing and turning in his sleep. He kept mumbling something under his breath, words I couldn't quite make out. When I leaned closer to listen, my heart nearly stopped. He wasn't speaking in his own voice anymore. It sounded like multiple voices overlapping each other, men and women, young and old, all whispering at once. I shook him awake, and he bolted upright with a gasp. "They're here," he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "Who's here?" I asked him. But he just shook his head and buried his face in his hands. The final straw came when I checked the RV's odometer before going to bed that night. It showed we'd driven over 50 miles since we parked, even though we hadn't moved an inch all day. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I woke up to find Lucas sitting outside the RV staring at the horizon. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept at all. His notebook was open in his lap, and he was drawing that same swirling symbol over and over again. I didn't want to push him too hard, but I couldn't ignore what was happening. "Lucas," I said gently, sitting down next to him, "can you tell me what this symbol means? Why do you keep drawing it?" He shook his head without looking at me. "I don't know," he murmured. "It's just there, in my head, like it's always been there." Maria joined us a few minutes later, carrying a small bundle of sage she'd picked nearby. She didn't say much, just nodded at Lucas and handed him the sage like it might help calm him down. Then she turned to me. "We need to talk," she said quietly. She led me a few steps away from Lucas and lowered her voice. "I've been thinking about those belongings we found last night, the way they were arranged. It reminded me of something my grandmother used to tell me when I was a kid." "What kind of something?" I asked. Maria hesitated, like she wasn't sure she wanted to say it out loud. "There are stories," she began slowly, "about things that live out here in the desert, things that can take your voice, your face, even your memories. My people call them skinwalkers." I frowned. "Skinwalkers? You mean like shapeshifters?" She nodded grimly. "They're not just legends, detective. My grandmother always said they feed on fear and confusion. They can make you doubt what's real, make you question who you are." I wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but after everything we'd seen so far, I couldn't shake the feeling that Maria might be onto something. Later that day, while searching for more clues near the campsite, we stumbled across an old leather satchel buried under some rocks. Inside was a vintage camera from the 1950s, a bulky thing with undeveloped film still loaded inside. Maria handed it to me carefully, like it might break if she touched it too hard. "This doesn't belong here," she said again. "Back at the RV, I developed the film using a portable kit I'd brought along for evidence collection. The photos were grainy and faded, but what they showed made my stomach drop. They were pictures of tourists, smiling and posing in front of the canyon walls, but in every photo there were shadowy figures standing behind them. The tourists didn't seem to notice the figures at all. They were completely unaware of what was lurking just inches away. I showed the photos to Maria and Lucas. Maria stared at them in silence for a long time before finally speaking. "This is why we don't camp here," she said firmly. "This land isn't safe." Lucas didn't say anything at first, but then he pointed to one of the photos, a picture of a young couple standing near a rock formation, and whispered, "That's them." "Who?" I asked. "The people who disappeared with me," he said shakily. They're still here." Before I could ask him what he meant, my police radio crackled to life inside the RV, the same radio I'd brought along just in case of emergencies. The voice on the other end was faint and distorted, but I recognized it immediately. It was a distress call, a recording of one of the missing tourists calling for help. Only problem was, that recording was from 3 years ago. The radio kept crackling, the voice fading in and out like it was fighting to be heard. "Help! Please! We're lost!" It sounded distant, almost like it was coming from underwater. Maria stared at the radio with wide eyes, her hand gripping the edge of the table. "That's not possible," she whispered. "That call is from years ago." Lucas didn't say anything. He just sat frozen in his chair, his face pale and his hands trembling. I reached for the radio and tried to respond, but all I got back was static. I didn't know what to think anymore. First the echoes, then the shadows, then the photos, and now this. It felt like something was playing with us, trying to mess with our heads. "We need to leave," Maria said suddenly. "This place isn't safe." But before we could make any plans, Lucas spoke up. "There's a cave," he said quietly. "I saw it when I was here before." Maria frowned. "What cave?" Lucas pointed toward the canyon walls in the distance. "It's hidden. You can't see it unless you're standing right in front of it." I didn't like the idea of going deeper into this nightmare, but if there was even a chance that Lucas's cave held answers, I had to check it out. So, we packed up some supplies and set off toward the spot Lucas described. It took us hours to find it, hours of climbing over rocks and squeezing through narrow passages, but eventually we reached a small opening in the canyon wall that looked like it had been carved out by hand. The air around it felt colder than it should have been, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Inside the cave, the walls were covered in carvings, symbols and shapes that looked ancient but unfamiliar. Maria ran her fingers over one of them and muttered something under her breath in Navajo. "What does it say?" I asked her. She hesitated before answering. "It's a warning," she said finally. "It talks about an entity that steals voices and appearances." I glanced at Lucas, who was staring at one of the carvings like he'd seen it before. "Is this what you've been drawing?" I asked him. He nodded slowly. "It's been following me," he whispered. Maria and I exchanged a worried look but didn't say anything. Instead, we kept exploring deeper into the cave until we reached a small chamber at the back. That's where things got even stranger. The air inside felt heavy, like time itself was slowing down, and when we turned to leave, we realized something was wrong. The sun had been high in the sky when we entered, but now it was almost dark outside. "How long were we in there?" Maria asked nervously. I checked my watch. It showed we'd only been inside for 20 minutes, but outside an entire day had passed. As we walked back toward camp, Maria pointed out something else that didn't make sense. Some of the rock formations around us looked different than they had earlier, like they'd shifted or changed shape while we were gone. Lucas stopped suddenly and turned to face us. "It's still here," he said quietly. "What is?" I asked him. He didn't answer right away. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said something that sent chills down my spine. "I don't think I'm me anymore." That night the wind picked up. By the time we got back to the RV, a full-blown dust storm was rolling in. The air was thick with sand, and the howling wind made it hard to hear anything else. We had no choice but to hunker down inside the RV and wait it out. At first it felt safe in there. The walls blocked out most of the noise, and the headlights cast a faint glow into the swirling storm outside. But as the hours dragged on, things started to feel wrong. It began with the voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then I realized I could hear them clearly, voices calling out from somewhere in the storm. They sounded familiar. Too familiar. "James," one of them called. "My name." It was my own voice, coming from outside. Maria stiffened in her seat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. "Stay here," I said, grabbing a flashlight and heading for the door. "Don't be stupid," Maria hissed, grabbing my arm before I could step outside. "That's not you out there." She was right. Deep down, I knew it wasn't me, or at least not this me, but curiosity got the better of me. I cracked open the door just enough to shine my flashlight into the storm. What I saw made my blood run cold. Standing in the swirling sand were 3 figures, 3 exact copies of us. One of them looked like me, one like Maria, and one like Lucas. They weren't moving. They just stood there, staring at the RV with blank expressions. I slammed the door shut and locked it. "We're not alone," I said grimly. Maria didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. She already knew something was out there pretending to be us. Lucas was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He hadn't said much since we got back from the cave, but now he looked up at us with tears in his eyes. "I think it's me," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" Maria asked him. "I think I'm one of them," he whispered. "I don't remember everything from when I disappeared, but sometimes I feel like I'm not supposed to be here." Maria and I exchanged a look but didn't say anything. There wasn't much we could say. As if things couldn't get worse, I noticed something strange about the RV itself. The walls, solid metal just hours ago, were starting to shimmer and fade in certain places, like they were becoming transparent. Through one of these spots, I could see something else. It wasn't our campsite anymore. It was another version of it, slightly different but close enough to recognize. Maria noticed it too and grabbed my arm tightly. "What's happening?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. Then Lucas spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's showing us other versions of ourselves." That's when I remembered something. The notes we'd found in the cave earlier that day. They weren't just random scribbles. They were written by someone who had been here before us, another investigator who'd tried to figure out what was going on in this canyon. I pulled out the notebook and flipped through it until I found what I was looking for. A passage that described an entity capable of creating duplicates, not just of people, but of entire realities. According to the notes, it fed on fear and confusion, using its victims' own doubts against them. "We're dealing with something that doesn't play by our rules," I said finally. "It can make us question what's real, and who's real." Maria nodded grimly, but didn't say anything. Lucas just stared at the floor like he was trying to hold himself together. Outside, the storm raged on, and so did the voices. The storm didn't let up. The voices outside grew louder, more insistent, calling our names over and over again. Sometimes they sounded like us, sometimes like the missing tourists we'd seen in the photos. It was like the storm itself was alive, trying to pull us out of the RV. Maria sat across from me, flipping through the notebook we'd found in the cave. She looked pale but focused, her fingers tracing over the strange symbols and carvings. "These markings," she said finally, "they're warnings. They say this thing, this entity, feeds on fear." I nodded. "That makes sense," I said quietly. "It's been messing with us since we got here, trying to make us doubt what's real." Lucas was sitting in the corner, his head resting against the wall. He hadn't spoken much since he'd admitted he wasn't sure if he was himself anymore. But now he looked up at us with a strange expression, half scared, half resigned. "What if I'm not me?" he asked suddenly. Maria froze, her eyes locking onto his. "Don't say that," she said firmly. "But what if it's true?" Lucas pressed. "What if I'm just an echo?" I didn't know how to answer him. Part of me wanted to reassure him, to tell him he was still Lucas, but another part of me wasn't so sure anymore. The way he'd been acting, the things he'd been saying, it all felt off. Maria broke the silence by pointing at one of the symbols in the notebook, a swirling shape similar to what Lucas had been drawing in his own notebook. "This symbol," she said slowly, "it's connected to sound." "What do you mean?" I asked her. She hesitated before answering. "The canyon itself, it's like an amplifier. The echoes here aren't normal. They're stronger than they should be. That's how this thing gets its power." I frowned, trying to piece it all together. "So you're saying the canyon is helping it?" Maria nodded grimly. "It's using the land, the acoustics, to mess with us." That explained a lot. The echoes that answered before we spoke. The voices outside, even Lucas's strange behavior. This thing wasn't just feeding on our fear, it was using the canyon itself to trap us. As if on cue, Lucas groaned and clutched his head like he was in pain. When Maria and I rushed over to check on him, he looked up at us with wide, terrified eyes. "I can feel it," he whispered. "It's pulling me apart." "What do you mean?" I asked urgently. Lucas shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know which version of me is real anymore." Maria grabbed his shoulders and forced him to look at her. "Listen to me," she said firmly. You're still you, you're still Lucas." But even as she said it, I could see doubt flicker across her face. That night, while Maria and Lucas tried to rest, I stayed up studying the notebook and staring at my caseboard inside the RV. At some point, probably around midnight, I noticed something strange. The board had rearranged itself. The photos and notes were still there, but they were connected in ways I hadn't noticed before, lines drawn between people and places that revealed patterns I hadn't seen earlier. It was like someone, or something, was showing me what I'd missed. One connection stood out. All of the disappearances had happened near a specific rock formation deep in the canyon, a place Maria had called Echo Point. According to her grandmother's stories, it was where this entity was strongest. If we wanted answers, and a way out, we'd have to go there. The next morning the storm had calmed down, but the air felt heavier somehow, like the canyon itself was holding its breath. None of us had slept much. Lucas looked worse than ever, his face pale and his hands shaking. Maria sat by the fire outside, staring at the horizon like she was trying to make sense of everything. I joined her, holding the notebook in my hand. "We need to go to Echo Point," I said quietly. Maria didn't look at me right away. "You're sure about that?" she asked. I nodded. "It's where everything leads. The disappearances, the carvings in the cave, they all point to that spot." Maria sighed and rubbed her temples. "If we go there," she said finally, "we need to protect ourselves." She pulled out a small pouch from her backpack and showed me what was inside. Herbs, stones, and other materials she said could ward off whatever was out there. "These are traditional Navajo protections," she explained. "They won't stop it completely, but they might keep us safe enough to get through." I didn't fully understand how it worked, but at this point I wasn't going to argue. We needed every advantage we could get. Lucas joined us a few minutes later, looking like he'd barely slept at all. He sat down next to Maria and stared at the pouch in her hands. "Will it work?" he asked quietly. Maria hesitated before answering. "It might," she said finally, "but you need to believe in it." Lucas nodded slowly, but I could see doubt in his eyes. Before we left, Maria suggested marking ourselves with unique identifiers, symbols or marks that would help us recognize each other if things got confusing. She handed each of us a piece of charcoal from the fire and told us to draw something on our arms. I drew a simple star on mine, something I'd used as a signature on case files for years. Maria drew a crescent moon on hers, and Lucas hesitated before sketching the swirling symbol he'd been drawing in his notebook. "Are you sure about that?" Maria asked him gently. Lucas nodded. "It feels right." With our marks in place and Maria's protective materials packed into my bag, we climbed into the RV and started driving toward Echo Point. The road was rough and winding, and the closer we got to the formation, the stranger things became. At one point, I glanced out the window and saw another RV driving alongside us, but it wasn't real. It flickered like a mirage, showing glimpses of another version of us inside. A version where Maria wasn't wearing her crescent moon mark and Lucas looked different. Maria noticed it too and grabbed my arm tightly. "Don't stop," she said firmly. I nodded and kept driving, refusing to look at the mirage again. When we finally reached Echo Point, the sun was starting to set. The rock formation loomed over us like a giant shadow, its jagged edges glowing faintly in the fading light. The air around it felt colder than it should have been, like stepping into another world entirely. Maria handed each of us a small bundle of herbs from her pouch and told us to hold on to them tightly. "Whatever happens," she said seriously, "don't let go." Lucas nodded but didn't say anything. He looked scared, more scared than I'd ever seen him, but he followed us as we started climbing toward the top of Echo Point. As we climbed higher, reality itself seemed to shift around us. The rocks changed shape when we weren't looking. Shadows moved in ways they shouldn't have, and distant echoes whispered words we couldn't understand. By the time we reached the top of Echo Point, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever this entity was, it wasn't just playing with us anymore. It was preparing for something bigger. The top of Echo Point was eerily quiet. The wind had stopped completely and the air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on us. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky in deep reds and oranges. We didn't have much time. Maria stood next to me, her bundle of herbs clutched tightly in her hand. Lucas was a few steps behind us, his face pale and his breathing shallow. He looked like he was barely holding himself together. "We need to move," Maria said quietly, her eyes scanning the area. I nodded and stepped forward, but before I could take another step, the ground beneath us seemed to shift. It wasn't a physical movement. It was more like reality itself was bending and twisting around us. The rock formations blurred and stretched, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was standing on solid ground or floating in midair. Then it appeared. First, it looked like a shadow, a dark shape that flickered and shifted like smoke. But as it moved closer, it started to take form. It wasn't just one thing. It was many things all at once. Faces flickered in and out of its shape. Faces of the missing tourists we'd seen in the photos. Their mouths moved as if they were speaking, but no sound came out. Maria gasped and took a step back. "It's them," she whispered. Lucas froze in place, his eyes wide with terror. "I can feel it," he said shakily. "It's inside me." The entity moved closer, its shape shifting with every step. It didn't walk. It glided across the ground like it was part of the air itself. When it stopped in front of us, it spoke. Not with one voice, but with many voices all at once. "You don't belong here," it said. Its words echoed through the canyon, bouncing off the walls and coming back to us louder than before. I felt my chest tighten as fear washed over me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "We're not leaving until we get answers," I said firmly. The entity's shape shifted again, its edges blurring like smoke caught in a breeze. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It split into 3 forms. One of them looked like me, an exact copy down to the star mark on my arm. Another looked like Maria, her crescent moon mark clearly visible, and the third looked like Lucas. Lucas stared at his duplicate in horror. "It's me," he whispered. Maria grabbed my arm tightly. "Don't trust anything," she said urgently. "Not even yourself." The duplicates stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate. The one that looked like me smiled faintly and spoke in my voice. "You don't belong here." Maria's duplicate reached out a hand toward her and said softly, "Come with me." Lucas's duplicate didn't say anything. It just stared at him with empty eyes. I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to run, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. We had to confront this thing. We had to stop it from pulling us apart. "Stay together," I said firmly. "No matter what happens." But then Lucas stepped forward, toward his duplicate. "Lucas!" Maria shouted. "Don't!" He turned back to look at us, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I think I'm already gone." Before we could stop him, Lucas reached out and touched his duplicate's hand, and in an instant, he disappeared. Maria cried out and tried to run after him, but I grabbed her arm and held her back. "It's too late," I said grimly. The entity turned its attention back to us now, its shape shifting again into something larger and darker than before. The faces of the missing tourists flickered across its surface one last time before it lunged toward us. Maria threw her bundle of herbs onto the ground and shouted something in Navajo, a chant or prayer that echoed through the canyon louder than anything else we'd heard so far. The entity hesitated for a moment, just long enough for us to make our move. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Maria's hand and pulling her toward the edge of Echo Point where the sun was setting fast. We ran as fast as we could, the entity chasing after us with impossible speed. The ground beneath our feet seemed to shift with every step, like reality itself was trying to trap us. But somehow we kept going. Just as we reached the edge of Echo Point where the sunlight hit the rocks directly, the entity stopped abruptly, as if it couldn't cross into the light. Maria turned back toward it and shouted one last prayer before collapsing onto the ground beside me. The entity screamed, a sound that echoed through the canyon so loudly it felt like my ears would burst, and then it disappeared into thin air. The canyon was silent. Maria and I sat there on the edge of Echo Point, breathing hard, our bodies trembling from exhaustion. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the horizon, casting long shadows over the rocks. The entity was gone, or at least it seemed to be. But Lucas wasn't with us anymore. I stared at the spot where he'd disappeared, my mind racing. He'd said he wasn't sure if he was real, that he thought he might be an echo. Maybe he was right. Maybe that's why he'd been the one to go. Or maybe he'd sacrificed himself to save us. Maria broke the silence first. "We need to leave," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but her face was pale, her eyes filled with grief. I nodded. "Yeah," I said softly. "Let's get out of here." We climbed back down the rock formation and made our way to the RV. The air felt lighter now, like whatever had been pressing down on us before was finally gone. But something still didn't feel right. As we drove back toward civilization, Maria stared out the window in silence. I could tell she was thinking about Lucas, about everything we'd just been through, but I didn't know what to say to comfort her. Truthfully, I wasn't sure how I felt either. Relief? Guilt? Confusion? Maybe all of those things at once. When we finally reached the nearest town, a small cluster of buildings on the edge of the desert, Maria turned to me and said, "Do you feel it?" "Feel what?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "Like something's different." I frowned but didn't say anything. Instead, I parked the RV and stepped outside to stretch my legs. That's when I noticed it, the subtle differences Maria was talking about. The layout of the streets wasn't quite how I remembered it. The mountains in the distance looked slightly different too, like they'd shifted somehow. It was small stuff most people wouldn't notice, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. Back in the RV, Maria pulled out an old map and spread it across the table. She traced her finger along the lines of Monument Valley, comparing them to what we'd seen during our escape. "This isn't right," she said finally. "The formations, they've changed." I leaned over her, shoulder and studied the map carefully. She was right. The shapes of some of the canyons were different now, subtle but unmistakable changes that couldn't be explained by erosion or time. "What does it mean?" I asked her. Maria shook her head slowly. "I don't know," she admitted. "For weeks. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in that canyon. About Lucas, about the entity, about everything we'd seen and heard. I spent hours comparing old maps and photos to new ones, trying to figure out if we'd missed something, if there was some clue I hadn't pieced together yet. And then one day, a postcard arrived in my mailbox. It didn't have a return address, just a simple picture on the front, a canyon formation that didn't exist anywhere on Earth, not in any map or photo I'd ever seen before. On the back was a short message written in neat handwriting. "Everyone is still here, Detective. Even you." It was signed, Lucas. I stared at that postcard for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it real? Was it some kind of trick? Or had Lucas somehow found a way to reach out from wherever or whatever he'd become? I don't know if I'll ever have answers to those questions. But one thing is certain. Monument Valley isn't just a place on a map anymore, it's something else entirely. And part of me will always wonder if I left a piece of myself behind in that canyon, or if maybe I never really left at all. My name is Robert Thornton, but most people call me Bobby. I'm an entomologist, someone who studies insects, and for as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated by the strange and beautiful world of bugs. Some people think it's weird, but for me, it's a passion. That's why I'm here, parked in the middle of the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee, inside my custom-built research RV. This isn't just any trip. I'm here to study one of nature's most fascinating phenomena, the 17-year cicada emergence. The cicadas are supposed to start crawling out of the ground in a few weeks, but I wanted to be ready. My RV is packed with recording equipment, specimen collection stations, and everything I need to document their behavior. It's like my own little science lab on wheels. The park rangers were kind enough to grant me an academic research permit for an extended stay, so I've got all the time I need to focus on my work. The mountains are breathtaking, lush green trees everywhere, birds chirping, and wildlife roaming freely. It's peaceful here, far away from the noise of the city and the politics of university life. Don't get me wrong, I love teaching, but dealing with all the bureaucracy? Not so much. This trip feels like a fresh start, a chance to reconnect with why I fell in love with science in the first place. Every morning I wake up early to check my equipment and take notes on the environment. The air smells crisp and clean, and there's something calming about being surrounded by nature. At night I sit outside under a blanket of stars, listening to the sounds of the forest. It's perfect, almost too perfect. For the first few days, everything went smoothly. I set up cameras and microphones around my campsite to capture every detail of the cicada's emergence when it happens. I even placed some sensors underground to detect their movements as they start digging their way up. This is going to be groundbreaking research. I can feel it. But then, things started getting strange. At first, it was small things I could explain away if I tried hard enough. On the 5th day, I noticed something odd. The cicadas were emerging early. Not just a few stragglers, which can happen, but hundreds of them. They were crawling out of the ground in perfect synchronization, their pale bodies glistening in the moonlight as they shed their shells. This wasn't supposed to happen for another 3 weeks. I double-checked my notes and my equipment. Maybe I'd miscalculated, but no, everything was correct. They were just early. I told myself it was exciting, a rare anomaly that could make my research even more valuable. But deep down, it didn't feel right. The way they moved, the way they swarmed together, it was almost too coordinated, like they were following some kind of unseen command. That night, as I sat outside with my headphones on, listening to the cicadas' calls through my recording equipment, I noticed something else. Their sounds weren't random like they usually are. There was a pattern to them, a rhythm that repeated over and over again. It was faint, almost like a whisper hidden beneath their usual buzzing. I leaned closer to the microphone, trying to make sense of it, and then I heard it. It wasn't just noise. It sounded intentional, like a language I couldn't understand. I pulled off the headphones and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I'd been working too hard. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I played back the recording later that night, the pattern was still there, clearer than ever. The next morning I found something that made my stomach turn. A small rabbit lay dead near one of my specimen stations. There were no bite marks or signs of injury, nothing to suggest what had killed it. It just looked empty, like something had drained the life out of it. By the end of the day, I found 2 more animals, a squirrel and a bird, both in the same condition. I tried to focus on my work, but an uneasy feeling settled over me like a heavy blanket. Something was wrong here, something I couldn't explain with science or logic. That night, as dusk fell over the mountains, the cicadas' buzzing grew louder than ever before. It filled the air like a living thing, wrapping around me until it felt like it was inside my head. And then, for just a moment, it stopped, completely silent. In that silence, I thought I heard something else. A faint whispering sound coming from the trees around me. I stood frozen by the RV door, straining to hear it again. But before I could make sense of it, the buzzing returned all at once, louder and more chaotic than before. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to focus on my work, but every time I stepped outside the RV, I felt eyes on me, like the forest itself was alive and keeping track of my every move. I spent most of the day reviewing my recordings. The cicada sounds were getting stranger by the hour. The patterns were more complex now, almost musical in a way. But when I slowed down the audio and analyzed it carefully, I found something chilling. Beneath their usual buzzing, there were subsonic frequencies, sounds too low for human ears to hear. My equipment had picked them up, though, and when I played them back, they made my chest tighten and my skin crawl. It wasn't just noise. It felt like communication. Later that afternoon, I decided to take a break and hike down to the ranger station for some fresh air and human interaction. On my way there, I ran into Elijah Wright, a local hunter and mountain man who looked like he'd stepped straight out of a history book. He was tall and wiry, with a long beard and eyes that seemed to see right through you. "You're the bug man, huh?" he said with a grin. I nodded. "That's me." Elijah leaned on his walking stick and squinted at me like he was sizing me up. "You picked a bad time to be out here," he said. "What do you mean?" He glanced at the forest around us and lowered his voice. "It's hunger time." "Hunger time?" I repeated, confused. He nodded slowly. "Every 17 years, things wake up in these mountains, things that ain't supposed to be awake. You ever hear about the cicada year tragedies?" I shook my head. Elijah sighed and pulled out a small leather pouch from his pocket. Inside were tiny charms made of twisted twigs and feathers. "Take one," he said, holding it out to me. I hesitated, but eventually took one of the charms. It felt rough in my hand, like it had been carved out of bone instead of wood. "Keep it close," Elijah said. "Might not save you, but it'll slow him down." I wanted to laugh it off, to tell him I didn't believe in superstitions, but something about his tone stopped me. He wasn't joking. That night back at the RV, things got worse. At exactly 3:17 a.m., my generator shut off without warning. The lights flickered once before plunging me into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and checked the generator outside. It looked fine, but it wouldn't start no matter what I did. When I went back inside, I found something that made my heart race: cicada shells scattered across the floor of the RV. They were everywhere, on the counters, in my bed, even inside locked cabinets. I hadn't brought them in. They couldn't have gotten inside on their own. For the first time since arriving here, I felt scared, really scared. The next night, I decided to stay up late and keep watch. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, something I couldn't explain. I set up my cameras and microphones as usual, but this time I stayed outside, sitting in a camping chair with a flashlight in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual rustling of leaves and distant hoots of owls seemed to have stopped. Around midnight, the cicadas' buzzing started again. It rose slowly at first, like a wave building in the distance, until it filled the air around me. I turned on my audio recorder and sat perfectly still, listening. The patterns were there again, those strange rhythms that felt almost like words, and then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow moving through the trees. I thought it might be a deer or maybe even a bear, but as it got closer, I realized it wasn't an animal. The cicadas were swarming together, their tiny bodies forming shapes that shouldn't have been possible. They were making something. I stood up slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The swarm kept shifting and twisting until it formed a shape, a massive humanoid figure made entirely of cicadas. It stood at the edge of the clearing, motionless, as if it were watching me. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. The figure tilted its head slightly, almost like it was curious about me. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were just clusters of glowing insects that seemed to pulse with light. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved back into a cloud of cicadas and disappeared into the trees. Stumbled back into the RV and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold my notebook to write down what I'd seen. My notes didn't make much sense, half scientific observations, half ramblings about what the swarm might be trying to communicate. I played back the footage from my trail cameras later that night. Most of it was static, just blurry images of trees and shadows, but one clip made my blood run cold. For a split second, one of the cameras caught something standing outside my RV window. A tall, insect-like figure with long limbs and glowing eyes. It wasn't human. And it wasn't just cicadas anymore. I woke up the next morning feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My body ached and my head throbbed with a dull pain that wouldn't go away. As I rolled out of bed, I noticed something strange on my arms. Tiny red marks, almost like scratches. At first I thought I'd brushed against something sharp during the night, but then I saw them on my legs too. They weren't scratches. They were small incisions. I froze. I grabbed a flashlight and examined the marks more closely. They were clean and precise, like they'd been made with a scalpel. My stomach churned as I pressed on one of them, and something moved beneath my skin. It was small, no bigger than a grain of rice, but it wriggled when I touched it. I stumbled into the bathroom, panic rising in my chest. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to calm down, but it didn't help. My mind was racing. What was happening to me? How had this gotten inside me? I needed help. I needed to leave. I grabbed my keys and ran outside to the RV's driver's seat, but when I turned the ignition, the engine wouldn't start. I popped the hood to check what was wrong and nearly screamed. The engine compartment was packed full of cicadas, thousands of them crawling over every surface, their wings buzzing angrily as they swarmed out toward me. I slammed the hood shut and backed away, breathing hard. There was no way I could drive out of here now. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Elijah arrived. He came walking up the dirt trail with his old rifle slung over his shoulder and a grim look on his face. "You look like hell," he said bluntly. I didn't even try to explain. I just showed him the marks on my arms and legs. His face darkened as he inspected them. "It's worse than I thought," he muttered under his breath. "What's happening to me?" I asked, my voice shaking. Elijah sighed and sat down on a nearby log. "You've been chosen," he said simply. "Chosen? For what?" He looked me dead in the eye. "The Brood Father." I stared at him, confused and terrified. Elijah explained that the Brood Father wasn't just some local legend. It was real. An ancient intelligence that used cicadas as its servants, emerging every 17 years to claim human host for its cycle of reproduction. The marks on my body were proof that it had already started. The eggs were inside me now, growing. "You've got two choices," Elijah said grimly. "You can let it take you, or you can fight back." Before I could respond, we heard footsteps behind us. It was Samantha, my wife. She'd come looking for me after my bizarre phone calls over the past few days. "Bobby," she called out as she approached the RV. My heart sank. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not now. Not when things had gotten so bad. "Samantha," I said quickly, trying to keep her calm. "You need to leave." She frowned at me, confused. "What are you talking about? What's going on?" Elijah stepped forward and pulled her aside before she could see the marks on my skin or the cicadas swarming around the RV. "It's not safe here," he said firmly. "You need to trust me." But Samantha wasn't leaving without answers, and neither was I. Samantha didn't leave. She refused to go anywhere until I told her what was happening. I couldn't blame her. If the roles were reversed, I wouldn't have left her either. But the truth? The truth was too much, even for me to say out loud. Elijah pulled me aside, while Samantha paced near the RV, clearly frustrated. "You need to tell her," he said quietly. "She's already in this now." I nodded, swallowing hard. My throat felt dry and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I walked over to her and took a deep breath. "Samantha," I started, my voice trembling. "Something's wrong with me." She frowned, her concern deepening. "What do you mean?" I rolled up my sleeves and showed her the marks on my arms. Her eyes widened as she stepped closer to examine them. Before I could explain further, one of the marks moved, something beneath my skin wriggling like it was alive. She gasped and stumbled back. "What is that?" I couldn't answer. Elijah stepped in and explained everything. The Brood Father, the cicadas, the eggs inside me. the cycle that had been repeating for centuries. Samantha listened in stunned silence, her face pale. "This can't be real," she whispered, shaking her head. "It is," Elijah said firmly. "And if we don't act fast, he won't be Bobby anymore." Samantha looked at me, tears welling up in her eyes. "We need to get you to a hospital." "It's too late for that," Elijah said grimly. "Doctors won't know what to do with this. The only way to stop it is with the ritual." "What ritual?" Samantha asked. Elijah hesitated before answering. "It's old, older than me, older than this mountain. It can extract the eggs before they hatch, but it's dangerous." I could see the fear in Samantha's eyes as she turned back to me. "We'll do it," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Elijah nodded and began preparing for the ritual while Samantha helped me back into the RV. My body felt heavier now, like something inside me was growing stronger by the minute. The marks on my skin had spread and tiny bits of chitin, hard insect-like plates, were starting to emerge around them. Samantha noticed but didn't say anything. She just held my hand tightly, refusing to let go. As night fell, the cicadas' buzzing grew louder than ever before. It surrounded us completely, vibrating through the walls of the RV like a living force. Elijah worked quickly outside, creating a circle of fire around us using dry branches and oil he'd brought with him. "This will keep them back for a while," he said as he came inside to explain the ritual. He handed Samantha a small knife and a bowl filled with strange herbs and powders. "You'll have to cut deep enough to get them out," he said quietly. Samantha stared at him in horror. "Me? I can't." "You're his wife," Elijah interrupted gently but firmly. "If anyone can save him, it's you." I looked at her, my vision blurry from pain and exhaustion. "You can do this," I whispered. She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face as she gripped the knife tightly. Outside, the cicadas swarmed against the fire barrier, their buzzing deafening now. The RV shook as they slammed against its walls in waves, desperate to get inside. "Whatever you do," Elijah said urgently, "don't stop until it's done." The fire outside crackled and roared, but it wasn't enough to drown out the sound of the cicadas. Their buzzing had turned into a deafening hum, vibrating through the walls of the RV like a living heartbeat. I could feel them, thousands of them, pressing against the windows, crawling over the roof, trying to break through. It felt like the whole forest was alive and angry. Inside, Samantha knelt beside me, her hands shaking as she held the knife Elijah had given her. She kept glancing at me and then at Elijah, who stood by the door with his rifle watching the swarm outside. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "You can," Elijah said firmly. "You don't have a choice." I reached out and grabbed her hand, even though my strength was fading fast. "It's okay," I said weakly. "I trust you." She nodded, tears streaming down her face as she steadied herself. Elijah handed her the bowl filled with herbs and powders. "Once you cut deep enough to get the eggs out, pour this over the wounds," he instructed. "It'll stop them from spreading." Samantha took a deep breath and pressed the knife against my arm, where one of the marks was moving beneath my skin. I clenched my teeth as pain shot through me, but I didn't scream. I couldn't. Not when she was already terrified. The first incision was small, but as soon as she cut into my skin, something wriggled out, a tiny white egg covered in slime. Samantha gasped and dropped the knife for a moment before quickly grabbing it again. "They're alive," she whispered in horror. "Keep going," Elijah barked from across the room. She worked quickly, cutting deeper into my arms and legs to remove more of the eggs. Each time she pulled one out, she poured the herbal mixture over the wound, which burned like fire but seemed to stop whatever was inside me from spreading further. Outside, the cicadas grew more aggressive. The RV shook violently as they slammed against it in waves, their buzzing turning into a high-pitched screech that made my ears ring. Elijah fired his rifle into the swarm several times, but it didn't seem to slow them down. "They're breaking through," he shouted. Samantha didn't stop. Her hands were covered in blood, my blood, but she kept going, tears streaming down her face as she worked to save me. I could feel myself slipping away, my vision blurring and my body growing colder, but I held on for her, for us. Finally, after what felt like hours, Samantha pulled out the last egg and poured the herbal mixture over my wounds one final time. She collapsed beside me, breathing hard and sobbing uncontrollably. "It's done," she whispered, but Elijah shook his head grimly. "Not yet." The fire outside was dying down and the cicadas were closing in fast. Their buzzing filled every corner of the RV now, drowning out everything else. Elijah grabbed a canister of oil and threw it onto what remained of the fire outside before lighting it with a match. The flames roared back to life for a moment, pushing the swarm back slightly. "We have to go," he said urgently. "Now." Samantha helped me to my feet as Elijah opened the RV door and fired his rifle into the swarm again. The three of us ran through the fire barrier toward Elijah's truck, parked nearby, cicadas swarming around us like a living storm. Just as we reached the truck, Elijah screamed. A mass of cicadas had engulfed him completely, dragging him down to the ground. Samantha tried to go back for him, but he shouted at us to keep going. "Run!" he yelled before disappearing beneath the swarm. Samantha pushed me into the truck and climbed in after me. She started the engine just as the cicadas began swarming over it, their wings beating against the windows like hailstones. The truck roared to life, and Samantha floored it, tearing down the dirt road as fast as she could while I slumped against her shoulder, barely conscious. The truck sped down the mountain road, bouncing over rocks and potholes. Samantha gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, while I slumped in the passenger seat, barely holding on. My body felt like it was burning from the inside out, and every breath was a struggle. The buzzing of the cicadas followed us, growing louder and louder as if they were chasing us. "They're not stopping," Samantha said, her voice trembling. She glanced at me, her eyes filled with fear. "What do we do?" I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and my words came out in a rasp. "Keep going." But deep down, I knew we couldn't outrun them. The cicadas weren't just insects, they were part of something bigger, something ancient and intelligent, and it wasn't going to let us go so easily. Suddenly, the truck lurched to a stop. Samantha slammed on the brakes and stared ahead in shock. The road was blocked by a wall of cicadas, millions of them swarming together in an impossible formation, their bodies twisting and writhing like a living barrier. "We can't go through that," she whispered. The buzzing grew deafening as the swarm began to shift again, forming shapes that made my stomach churn. First, it looked like a giant hand reaching toward us, then a face. An enormous humanoid face made entirely of cicadas. Its glowing eyes stared directly at me. I felt something stir inside me, a pull I couldn't resist. My body moved on its own as I opened the truck door and stepped out into the night. "Bobby!" Samantha screamed, grabbing my arm to stop me. "What are you doing?" I have to," I said, though I didn't understand why. It was like the thing in front of me was calling to me and I couldn't ignore it. Samantha refused to let go. "No, you're not going anywhere." The swarm shifted again, swirling around us like a tornado. The air was thick with the sound of wings and the smell of earth and decay. In the chaos, I heard something else, a voice. It wasn't human, but it spoke directly into my mind. "You are ours," it said. The cycle must continue. I fell to my knees as pain shot through my body. My skin felt like it was tearing, apart as more chitinous plates pushed through, covering parts of my arms and chest. My vision blurred, but I could still see the massive face of the swarm watching me. Samantha knelt beside me, holding my face in her hands. "Bobby, stay with me. Don't let it take you." Her voice cut through the fog in my mind, grounding me for just a moment. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fear and love in her eyes. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "You're not leaving me." Elijah's words echoed in my mind. The ritual can stop it. But he hadn't told us what would happen if we failed, or if we were too late. Samantha grabbed the bowl of herbs and powders from the truck and began chanting something Elijah had taught her earlier. Her voice was shaky, but determined as she poured the mixture over my wounds again. The swarm screamed, an ear-piercing sound that made both of us cover our ears. The face dissolved into chaos as the cicadas swirled faster around us, their movements erratic and angry. "It's working," Samantha shouted over the noise. But then I felt it, the thing inside me fighting back. My body convulsed as pain tore through me like fire. The plates on my skin cracked and fell away in pieces, but with each one that disappeared I felt weaker. "Samantha," I gasped. "You have to finish it." She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Tears streamed down her face as she pressed her hands against my chest and poured what remained of Elijah's mixture over my body. The swarm screamed again, louder this time, as if it were dying along with whatever was inside me. The cicadas began to fall from the air one by one until they covered the ground like a carpet of dead insects. And then, silence. I collapsed into Samantha's arms, barely conscious but alive. She held me tightly, sobbing into my shoulder as the last few cicadas buzzed weakly before falling still. The silence after the swarm disappeared was almost as unsettling as the buzzing had been. The forest, which had been alive with chaos just moments ago, now felt empty. The only sound was Samantha's quiet sobbing as she held me close, her arms wrapped tightly around my trembling body. "It's over," she whispered more to herself than to me. "It's finally over." I wanted to believe her, but deep down I wasn't sure. My body felt broken, weak and hollow, but at least the burning pain was gone. The strange marks on my skin had faded, and the chitinous plates that had started to form were gone too. For the first time in days, I felt human again. Samantha helped me back into the truck. The road ahead was still littered with dead cicadas, their bodies crunching under the tires as we drove away from the mountain. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There wasn't much to say. By the time we reached civilization, the sun was starting to rise. Its warm light spilled over the horizon, chasing away the darkness that had haunted us for so long. I leaned my head against the window, watching the world come back to life as Samantha drove us toward safety. We checked into a small motel on the edge of town, where Samantha insisted on cleaning and bandaging my wounds. She didn't say much, just worked quietly, her hands shaking slightly as she wrapped each cut with care. I could see how tired she was, how much this had taken out of her. "Thank you," I said softly when she finished. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just promise me you'll never go back there." I nodded, though something inside me hesitated. I didn't want to go back, not after everything we'd been through, but a part of me still felt connected to that place, to the cicadas and whatever ancient force had called them together. We stayed at the motel for a few days while I recovered. Samantha called a friend of mine from the university to explain what had happened. Well, part of it anyway. And they agreed to send someone else to finish my research project. I didn't argue. I knew I couldn't face those mountains again, or so I thought. 17 years later, the Great Smoky Mountains hadn't changed much since my last visit. The trees were still tall and green, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The air smelled fresh and earthy, just like I remembered it. I parked my car in a clearing near the same spot where my RV had once been, and stepped out into the cool morning air. My hands trembled slightly as I unpacked my equipment, newer and more advanced than what I'd used all those years ago. The cicadas were due to emerge again soon. Their familiar buzzing had already started in the distance, faint but growing stronger with each passing hour. I set up my cameras and microphones carefully, making sure everything was positioned just right. As I worked, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in one of the camera lenses, a face lined with age but still recognizable as my own. Except for one thing. When I moved closer to adjust the angle of the lens, I saw it clearly. A small patch of chitinous plating beneath the skin on my neck. It shimmered faintly in the sunlight before disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I smiled faintly and whispered under my breath, "The brood remembers." As if in response, the cicadas' buzzing grew louder around me, a chorus that seemed almost welcoming. The cycle continues. My name is Marshall Lawson. I'm 38 years old and I'm a wildlife photographer. At least that's what I tell people now. Before this, I was a soldier in Vietnam. I don't like to talk about it much. The war left me with scars, not just the ones you can see, but the kind that wake you up at night, sweating and shaking. PTSD, they call it. I call it a nightmare that never ends. A few months ago, my childhood friend Phil Dawkins reached out to me. He's a forest ranger in California, working near the Redwood National Forest. He said the fresh air and peaceful woods might help me heal, maybe even help me sleep again without those awful dreams. I wasn't sure, but I figured it was worth a shot. So I packed up my gear, bought a used Winnebago Brave RV, and drove out west. The first thing you notice about the redwoods is how big they are. Massive trees stretching up so high you can barely see the tops. It's quiet here, too. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the kind that feels alive. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind. It's the sort of peace I hadn't felt in years. Phil met me when I arrived and showed me around. He'd arranged for me to stay near an old ranger outpost deep in the forest. "It's remote," he said, "but you'll have everything you need." He handed me a map with some areas marked as restricted zones. When I asked about them, he just shrugged and said, "Nothing to worry about, just places we don't want people wandering into." I set up camp near a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. My RV felt cozy enough, and after unpacking my camera gear, I started exploring the area. The wildlife was incredible. Deer grazing quietly, squirrels darting between branches, birds singing their hearts out. It was exactly what I needed. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking up in a panic. No nightmares about gunfire or explosions, just the sound of crickets outside my window. Over the next couple of days, I started cataloging animal behavior for my photography project. But something strange caught my attention. Certain parts of the forest seemed empty. No deer tracks, no bird song, nothing. It felt like those areas were avoiding something. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just coincidence or some natural pattern I didn't understand yet. But as peaceful as everything seemed on the surface, there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind, like something wasn't quite right. On my third day in the forest, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything big at first, just small things that I couldn't explain. That morning, I was reviewing some photos I'd taken of a deer grazing near the edge of the clearing. The shots were beautiful, soft sunlight streaming through the trees, the deer perfectly framed. But in the background of one photo, I noticed something strange. There was a tall, dark shape standing between the trees. It wasn't clear enough to make out details, but it wasn't a tree or an animal. It almost looked like a person, but it was too tall, at least 8 or 9 feet. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Later, that afternoon, while I was organizing my gear inside the RV, the radio suddenly crackled to life. At first, I thought it was picking up a nearby station, but the voices didn't sound right. They were faint and broken, like fragments of conversations from another time. I could barely make out words like help and lost. Then it went silent again. I tried to brush it off as some kind of interference, but it left me uneasy. The forest was supposed to be quiet and peaceful, but now it felt like it was watching me. That evening, as I was setting up my wildlife cameras around the clearing, I noticed something carved into one of the nearby trees. It looked like an ancient symbol, a circle with jagged lines running through it. There were several more symbols carved into other trees around my campsite. They looked old, worn down by time and weather, but they didn't seem random. Someone had put them there for a reason. I didn't know much about Native American history or folklore, but something about those carvings made me feel small, like they were warning me about something bigger than myself. When night fell, things got stranger. My wildlife cameras were supposed to trigger automatically when something moved in front of them. But when I checked them later, none of them had captured anything. even though their batteries were completely drained. They'd been fully charged earlier that day. As I sat in my RV that night with only the sound of crickets outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. The next morning, I decided to venture deeper into the forest. I needed answers, or at least something to explain the strange things I'd been seeing and hearing. Phil had marked certain areas on the map as restricted zones, but curiosity got the better of me. I packed my camera, a flashlight, and some snacks and headed out. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. The trees in certain areas looked wrong. Their trunks were twisted, almost like they'd been bent by some massive force. Branches were broken high up, far out of reach of any animal. The ground was littered with claw marks and patches of dirt that looked like they'd been dug up recently. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled across an abandoned campsite. The tents were old and torn, the fabric faded from decades of exposure. There was a rusty metal cooler tipped over on its side, and scattered around it were cans of food from the 1950s, labels peeling and barely readable. Inside one of the tents, I found a journal tucked under a pile of rotting blankets. The journal belonged to someone named Henry. From what I could piece together, Henry had come here with friends for a camping trip years ago. The entries started off normal, talking about hiking trails and fishing spots, but as I flipped through the pages, his tone changed. He wrote about hearing knocking sounds at night, like someone tapping on the trees around their campsite. Then, he mentioned feeling like he was being watched. One entry stopped me cold. There are eyes in the trees. They don't blink, they don't move, but they're always there. I shoved the journal into my backpack and hurried back to my RV, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time I got back, it was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. That night was worse than any night before. It started with knocking sounds, soft at first like distant echoes in the forest. But as the hours passed, they grew louder and closer until it felt like they were coming from all sides of the RV. I sat frozen in my seat, gripping a flashlight, like it was my only lifeline. Then my food started to go bad, fast. Apples that had been fresh that morning turned brown and mushy within minutes. Bread grew moldy right before my eyes. Even sealed cans of soup smelled rotten when I opened them. Tried to distract myself by focusing on my photography project, but it didn't help. My mind kept drifting back to Henry's journal, and those eyes he'd written about. To make matters worse, my nightmares returned that night with a vengeance. Except this time, they weren't just memories from Vietnam. They were mixed with flashes of what was happening now. Twisted trees, knocking sounds, dark shapes moving between shadows. When I woke up drenched in sweat, I swore I heard breathing outside the RV window. The next morning, Phil showed up unexpectedly. I was relieved to see a familiar face, but something about him seemed off. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around like he was expecting something to jump out of the trees at any moment. "You're not supposed to be out here this deep," he said, his voice low and hurried. "This is Wendigo territory." "Wendigo?" I asked, confused. "What are you talking about?" Phil didn't answer right away. He just shook his head and muttered, "You need to pack up and leave. Today." Before I could press him for more details, he climbed into his truck and drove off without another word. His warning left me shaken, but I wasn't ready to leave just yet. I told myself it was just a local legend, something meant to scare people away from restricted areas. That night, as I sat in the RV trying to make sense of everything, I heard a voice outside. It was Phil. "Marshall," he called, his voice calm but urgent. "Open the door. I need help." I froze. Something about his tone didn't feel right. It was too calm, too steady. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. "Marshall," the voice repeated, closer this time. "It's me. Let me in." My stomach twisted into knots. Phil had driven off hours ago. There was no way he'd be back this soon. And even if he was, why wouldn't he just knock on the door? I stayed quiet, barely breathing as the voice circled the RV. Then it stopped. The silence was worse than the knocking or the voice. It stretched on for what felt like hours until I finally worked up the courage to look outside again. About a mile down the road, I found Phil's truck abandoned with its doors wide open. The engine was still running, but there was no sign of him anywhere. On the passenger seat, I found a stack of old newspaper clippings about missing persons in the area, cases dating back to the 1920s. The headlines were chilling. Hikers vanish without a trace. Campers report strange noises before. Disappearing. Search parties find no clues. As I stood there holding those clippings, I felt like someone or something was watching me from the trees. I ran back to the RV as fast as I could and locked every door and window behind me. The next few days were a blur of fear and unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. Every sound outside, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. I spent most of my time inside the RV, peeking out the windows, hoping to see Phil but dreading what else might be out there. Then, one evening, the weather turned. Dark clouds rolled in fast, swallowing the sky and casting an eerie shadow over the forest. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees and making them groan like they were alive. I could feel it in my gut. Something bad was coming. As the storm approached, I tried to prepare. I secured everything outside and double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked. But as the first drops of rain hit the roof, I realized how helpless I really was. There was no way out, not with the storm closing in. The rain came down in sheets, hammering against the RV like it wanted to break through. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the RV on its wheels. I huddled inside, clutching a flashlight and trying to convince myself that I'd be okay. Then, without warning, the RV's engine sputtered and died. The lights flickered once before going out completely, leaving me in total darkness. My stomach dropped. I tried turning the key in the ignition, but nothing happened. The RV was dead. That's when I heard it. A low growl outside, barely audible over the storm, but unmistakable. It wasn't an animal sound. It was deeper, more guttural, like something ancient and hungry. My hands shook as I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it out the window. I couldn't see anything at first, just rain and shadows, but then my wildlife camera started flashing outside. My heart raced as I pulled up the footage on my tablet, desperate to see what had triggered it. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the flickering light of the camera, a massive figure moved between the trees. It was tall, at least 9 feet, with long, spindly limbs that looked too thin to support its body. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and atop its head were antlers that twisted like gnarled branches. It moved silently despite its size, gliding through the forest, like a shadow brought to life. I stumbled back from the screen, my breath coming in short gasps. This was it, the thing Phil had warned me about. The Wendigo. The creature circled closer to the RV, its shape barely visible through the rain-streaked windows. Then came the scratching, a slow, deliberate sound as its claws dragged across the metal walls. It wasn't trying to break in, not yet, but it wanted me to know it was there. I forced myself to focus. My military training kicked in as I scanned the RV for anything I could use as a weapon. A camera tripod, a heavy flashlight, some tools. I grabbed whatever I could find and piled them within reach. The storm raged on outside as I fortified myself inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened to the creature's movements, its heavy breathing, its claws tapping against the windows. I didn't know how long this would last, or if I'd make it through the night. But one thing was clear. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. The storm didn't let up, and neither did the creature. It stayed close to the RV, circling like a predator stalking its prey. Every so often it would scratch at the walls, or tap on the windows. The sound was slow and deliberate, like it was testing me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I kept myself busy by setting up makeshift defenses. I wedged furniture against the doors and windows and tied kitchen knives to the ends of broom handles, making crude spears. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Then I remembered the hidden compartment I'd noticed when I first bought the RV. It was built into the floor under the bed, and I hadn't paid much attention to it before. Now, with nothing else to do but wait, I pried it open. Inside, I found a leather-bound journal and a stack of old photographs. The journal belonged to the RV's previous owner, a man named Richard. As I flipped through its pages, my stomach tightened. Richard had been investigating disappearances in this area, just like me, and he'd come face to face with the same creature. His notes were detailed and terrifying. He described how the Wendigo hunted its victims, using their voices to lure others into the forest. He wrote about its ability to drain energy from electronics and food, leaving people weak and vulnerable. But what chilled me most was his description of how the Wendigo came to be. According to Richard, the Wendigo wasn't just a monster, it was a curse. People who became lost in these woods, desperate and starving, would sometimes turn to cannibalism to survive. That act of desperation would transform them into something inhuman, a Wendigo. Over time, they'd lose their humanity entirely, becoming creatures driven only by hunger. The photos in the compartment backed up his story. They showed a man, gaunt and pale, slowly transforming over time. In one photo, his fingers were unnaturally long. In another, antlers were beginning to sprout from his head. By the last photo, he was unrecognizable, a full Wendigo. I felt sick as I realized what this meant. The creature outside my RV had once been human. Richard's journal also mentioned ways to fight back. The Wendigo could be repelled by silver and fire, two things I didn't have much of. But then I remembered my silver photo frames. They weren't much, but they might be enough. I grabbed a small pot from the kitchen and melted down the frames over my portable stove. The process took hours, but by morning, I had enough silver to coat the tips of my makeshift weapons. As dawn broke, I tried using my radio to call for help again. This time I got an answer, but it wasn't what I expected. "Don't let it inside." Phil's voice crackled through the static. "No matter what you hear, don't let it inside." The connection cut out before I could respond. I sat there in silence for a long time, staring at the radio. Was Phil alive? Or was this just another trick? Either way, his warnings stuck with me. By now, I knew what I was up against, and I knew that if I didn't act soon, it would get me too. That night, the storm finally started to ease up, but the creature didn't. It stayed close to the RV, its movements growing bolder. The scratching at the walls turned into pounding, like it was testing the strength of the metal. I could hear its growls now, low and guttural, vibrating through the air like thunder. I sat in the corner with my silver-coated weapons, my heart racing as I tried to think of a plan. I couldn't stay inside forever. If it broke through, I'd have nowhere to run. My military training told me to stay calm and focus, but it was hard when every instinct screamed at me to panic. Then it happened. The skylight shattered with a deafening crash. Glass rained down as a long, pale arm reached inside, clawing at the edges of the opening. The creature's antlers appeared next, scraping against the frame as it tried to force its way in. I didn't think, I just acted. Grabbing one of my silver-tipped spears, I lunged forward and jabbed it at the creature's arm. The moment the silver touched its skin, it let out an ear-piercing shriek that made my ears ring. Its arm recoiled, like I'd burned it, and for a moment I thought I might actually have a chance. But then I heard something outside, a voice. "Marshall!" It was Phil again, shouting from somewhere near the clearing. "Help me, please!" I froze. Was it really him this time? Or was this another trick? My mind raced as I tried to decide what to do. "Marshall!" Phil's voice came again, closer now. "It's me. Open the door." I hesitated for a moment too long. The creature outside roared in frustration and slammed its body against the RV, rocking it on its wheels. I stumbled backward, clutching my weapon as I tried to keep my balance. Then I saw him, or what looked like him, standing outside the RV window. Phil's face was pale and bloodied, his eyes wide with fear as he reached out toward me. "Please," he begged. "I'm hurt. Let me in." Something about him seemed off. His movements were too smooth, too unnatural. And his timing, it was too perfect. No, I whispered under my breath, shaking my head. Phil's face twisted into something horrible. His mouth stretched impossibly wide, his eyes darkened into pits of shadow. And then he wasn't Phil anymore. He was the Wendigo. The creature slammed against the RV again, harder this time, cracking one of the windows. It screeched in rage as it realized I wasn't falling for its tricks. I didn't wait for it to break through completely. I grabbed my second weapon and lit one of my makeshift torches using a can of lighter fluid from the kitchen, fire and silver. That's what Richard's journal had said. With a deep breath, I kicked open the RV door and charged outside. The Wendigo was waiting for me. Its towering frame hunched over like a predator ready to pounce. Its antlers glistened in the moonlight as it let out another guttural growl that shook me to my core. I swung my torch first, aiming for its face. The flames caught on its skin, making it shriek and stumble backward. Then I jabbed at its chest with my silver-tipped spear, driving it back further into the clearing. The fight felt like it lasted forever. Every swing of my weapon took all the strength I had left, but eventually, the creature retreated into the shadows of the forest. Its shrieks echoed through the trees until they faded completely. I stood there for a long time after it disappeared, gasping for air and clutching my weapons like they were lifelines. For now, I'd survived. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The forest was eerily quiet after the Wendigo disappeared. The storm had passed, leaving behind a damp stillness that felt heavier than the rain itself. I stood in the clearing, clutching my silver-coated spear and torch, my muscles aching from the fight. My mind was racing, but one thought kept repeating. I needed to get out of here. I grabbed my backpack and started walking. The RV was useless now, the engine was dead, and the skylight was shattered. I couldn't stay there any longer. Using the map Phil had given me, I decided to follow a nearby stream. It wasn't marked as a restricted zone, and I figured it might lead me to safety or at least to some kind of civilization. The hike was slow and exhausting. Every step felt like a struggle, but I forced myself to keep moving. The forest seemed different now, darker, quieter. Even the birds and insects were silent, as if they knew something terrible had happened. After what felt like hours, I stumbled across a cave hidden behind a cluster of trees. At first, I thought about ignoring it and continuing on, but something drew me closer. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the faint sound of movement coming from inside. I stepped into the cave cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air inside was cold and damp, and the walls were lined with strange markings, symbols similar to the ones I'd seen carved into the trees near my campsite. Then I saw them, piles of belongings scattered across the cave floor. Backpacks, shoes, cameras, all left behind by people who had disappeared over the years. My stomach churned as I realized how many victims there must have been. But that wasn't the worst part. Deeper in the cave, I found them, the half-transformed victims. They were twisted and broken, their bodies caught somewhere between human and Wendigo. Some had antlers growing from their heads. Others had elongated fingers or pale, stretched skin. Their eyes were wide with fear and pain, but they didn't move. They just stared at me. One of them whispered something so faint I almost didn't hear it. "Help me." I froze. My heart felt like it was being crushed in my chest. These people weren't alive. Not really. But they weren't dead either. They were trapped in some horrible in-between state, suffering endlessly. I knew what I had to do. Using my torch and silver-coated weapons, I mercy-killed them one by one. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Harder than anything I'd faced in Vietnam, but I couldn't leave them like that. They deserved peace. When it was over, I sat on the cave floor for a long time, staring at my hands covered in soot and blood. The weight of what I'd done, and what I'd seen, was almost too much to bear. As dawn broke outside the cave, I realized something else. My fingers were starting to change. They were longer than they should have been, and my skin looked paler. Under the morning light, the infection had started. I knew then that I couldn't go back, not to civilization, not to Phil or anyone else. If this curse spread to me completely, I'd become like them, a monster driven by hunger. I left the cave and wandered deeper into the forest, away from anyone who might find me. If this was my fate, then at least I could keep it from hurting anyone else. Weeks later, a search party found my RV abandoned in the clearing. They recovered my wildlife cameras and photos, and what they saw chilled them to their core. The final photos showed me standing near the cave entrance with elongated fingers and pale skin, beginning to transform into something unrecognizable.